What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review Ridley Scott's adaptation of Peter Heller's novel, The Dog Stars. The movie stars Jacob Elordi, Margaret Qually, Josh Brolin, and Guy Pearce. And let me just start with this. I went into this movie with zero expectations. I saw that reviews out there were mixed at best. But I'm a lifelong fan of Ridley Scott. Even if my favorite movies by Ridley tend to have a little age on them, that said, I like The Dog Stars. I thought the trailer was a little bland and generic, but I got way more invested emotionally in the story than I anticipated. And I'm not necessarily a junkie for grim dystopian movies about people trying to survive in a depressing future, but this movie's not all doom and gloom. It's got some thrills, some chills, some romance, a little optimism, and a bonkers third act that I'll get to in my spoiler section. But as Will Ferrell famously said in Anchorman, that escalated quickly, but let's start with the basics. This is a story about a pilot named Hig and his dog Jasper, and they spend their days flying around the American West looking for survivors that they can try and help out as humanity struggles to recover from a plague that wiped out most of the population. Now, the world in which this story is set might be sparsely populated. However, there are still plenty of dangers lurking out there in the wilderness, as well as a few potential allies like the character played by Margaret Qually, who, in spite of living in the middle of nowhere with her father, still struts around in tight jean shorts and keeps her legs and armpits perfectly shaved, just in case a hottie like Jacob Elordi were to land his plane nearby and come looking for help. This is still a Hollywood movie after all, and I'm not complaining. Margaret Qualley can do no wrong in my eyes.
My name is Hig.
I'm Seema.
The original novel from 2012 was adapted by screenwriters Mark L. Smith and Christopher Wilkinson. I have no idea if they took any liberties with the book or not. It felt like it could have been the first story in a series of adventures set in this landscape, but apparently it's a standalone novel. But the movie's structured really loosely, and I suspect a lot of people will get discouraged early on with at least the early emphasis on the day-to-day details of surviving in a world after a flu virus has killed off most of the population. But if you have a little patience, or you're just really into the nitty-gritty when it comes to tales of survival, not to worry, the Mad Max-style lunatics preying on survivors will eventually show their faces. They roam the American West like packs or tribes, almost like a herd of buffalo, and they kind of look like me if I were to clone myself many times over and then cover my army with all these bizarre tattoos. And the movie slowly but surely evolves into this tale of survival where like the last remnants of civilization that are barely hanging on by their fingernails are slowly being encircled by, like the barbarian hordes. It's a tale of civilization versus savagery, and yeah, I was totally into it. I'm not going to say it's on the level of Blade Runner or Alien or any of the other movies by Ridley Scott that I really love, but let's start there with Ridley Scott, who's now 88 fucking years old, but it's still directing movies like a person who's like, half his years, if not a third of his years. It's astonishing how he's been able to stay at this level of the game for this long. Probably only like Steven Spielberg and like Martin Scorsese and a few other people from the 70s have been able to make the same claim, and obviously all of them have had their cold periods and their hot periods and that sort of thing. But even if I'm the first to acknowledge that a lot of Ridley Scott's recent movies like Napoleon or Gladiator 2 are not what I would describe as like peak Ridley Scott, however, what is undeniable is that his eye remains intact. And this movie gives him many opportunities to show off what he can do when it comes to cinematography. And he's been working with a lot of good DPs throughout his entire career, but he started in commercials and music videos before shifting into features with The Duelist. And what was cool about the screening at the Alamo Drafthouse is that before the movie started, they're showing some of his old music videos and some of his old commercials. They showed the famous Macintosh commercial, which only aired one time, I think back in 1984, obviously, because they were doing a satire of the movie and the novel, 1984. But they were showing the music video to the song Avalon by Roxy Music. But in spite of the many peaks and valleys of his career across the last 50 years, his movies are always stunning to look at. They're always gorgeous. This guy knows how to place a camera. He knows how to light a scene. And if you just want to watch two really attractive actors falling in love while flying around mountains, well, then this movie's got plenty of scenes that'll keep you very entertained. But along the way, we also get to enjoy some really gnarly action scenes. And sometimes it's something as simple as like something going wrong on the plane, having to do an emergency crash landing and fix things before something is horribly wrong or you get attacked or whatever the case might be. Or sometimes it's characters like Josh Brolin, who's been waiting for the apocalypse for his entire life, and he's actually kind of thrilled that it's finally arrived. This is, I guess, a mild spoiler, but at one point Jacob Elordi accuses him of enjoying the shit, and that he was ready for the apocalypse 10 years before it arrived because he's got clean water, he's got energy, he's got an arsenal, he's got food.
Here it's just us trying to hold on to what was.
But out there,
it's kill or be killed.
He's got this compound that's easy to defend, and he just loves it. He's a genuine sniper, and he's just eating it up and having the time of his life. He's got a much more kind of grim and cynical view on humanity, and he's happy just to hang out and smoke cigars and drink bourbon or drink whatever whiskey he likes and shoot people as they try to come onto his land. Josh Brolin, in a lot of ways, kind of steals the show. And the one time in this movie, I'm not going to say when, where, or how, but the one time in this movie where I got real chills down my arms and in my neck, it was a scene involving Josh Brolin where I was like, I was not expecting to be moved like this, but as I said before in my intro, there's a little bit of hope and optimism in this movie that I was not anticipating. I was expecting it to be just a grim, relentless, joyless slog in a lot of ways, but I think people are going to be surprised by not the message of the movie, but the overall tone of the movie by the time they reach the conclusion. But when it comes to the potential audience for this movie, I think there are two main groups that are just going to eat it up with a spoon. First and foremost, if you have any prepper instincts of any kind, if you've ever built a bunker, or if you've ever started stashing medicine and supplies for a rainy day in case the apocalypse comes. Like I remember when Y2K was rolling around in the late 90s, a lot of people started preparing for the downfall of humanity, and they were like, you're going to be jealous when Y2K arrives and no power is working, and I've got all my good stuff, ready to rock. I think so preppers, they're going to have a lot of fun with this. And I feel like between shows like The Last of Us or movies like Mad Max, obviously, there have been a lot of shows and movies dealing with the apocalypse in recent years. This one's a little bit more grounded. So if you like a little bit more gritty realism when it comes to your dystopian science fiction movies, I think this movie will be right up your alley. But the other audience, obviously, is for people who like anything related to dystopian hellscapes of the future. And I'm talking to my niece, who's 13 years old, who mostly is just a Hunger Games fanatic. She loves the Hunger Games books, kind of like some of the movies, but she's mainly a big fan of the books, but she's just discovering her love and affection for any sort of dystopian, futuristic, sci-fi setting where things have gone horribly wrong, and for whatever reason, she's just eating it up like ice cream. She loves it. So I'm not going to name her name because she's a 13-year-old girl, but I'm going to definitely send the trailer to her to see if it grabs her interest. And if she happens to have a crush on Jacob Elordi, so much the better. But it's interesting seeing Jacob Elordi transition from TV star, from shows like Euphoria, into more of a leading man in the movies. And I guess the future remains uncertain as to just how far he might go, but obviously he played the monster in Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, and he got to play Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. So he's been getting some big roles. And if you're working with Guillermo del Toro and Ridley Scott and all these other big directors, clearly those directors, he's on their short list of acceptable hot guys that you can put in a movie. I always find him a little bit too withdrawn or stoic. I feel like he keeps too much emotion in reserve, or at least he does in a lot of these movies. And I wish he would find a role where he could really really cut loose and go batshit. But he's very low key, Mr. No Big Deal. He's very kind of calm, quiet, and resourceful in this movie. But I hope at some point he'll find an opportunity to really show off some rage and that sort of thing. But I think on the show Euphoria, he was just too happy all the time because he got to spend 90% of that show making out with Sydney Sweeney. Obviously, the fate of his character in that show was less positive. But in general, I think he had a lot of fun getting to shoot that show across those 3 seasons. But I do think his stock will continue to go up after people see him in this movie. And for years, I kept thinking that Austin Butler was going to be the new hot guy leading man, the heir apparent to people like Leonardo DiCaprio or Brad Pitt, people that are so physically beautiful that women just melt when they see him. But Jacob Elordi appears to have become that guy. And I remember asking my little sister, who's 24, I think sometime last year, and I told her to make a choice between Timothée Chalamet and Jacob Elordi, and she didn't even hesitate. Timothée Chalamet did not interest her in any way, shape, or form. Jacob Elordi, that's what she was into. And so I think Jacob Elordi has the potential. He's tall, he's got the cheekbones, and he's a pretty good actor. Now he just needs to find some movies where guys will become fans of him. Like with Leo, it took a long time before guys started rooting for him. I remember it was around the time of The Departed. It was oh, Leo, he's actually making movies that someone who's vaguely masculine might enjoy, as opposed to just being this kind of dreamy heartthrob in all these movies. And the same with Brad Pitt. For a long time, he was just the hot, beautiful guy with long hair, and movies like Legends of the Fall, and all the girls were swooning. But then he started making movies like Fight Club and Snatch. It's hey, Brad Pitt, you're one of us. And so Jacob, I think this movie, because Jacob Elordi is he's resourceful and he's tough, and he's a pilot and he's a mechanic and he's a tough guy, and he's a hot girlfriend and all that stuff. I do think some guys will see this and start to look at him in a slightly different light, as opposed to movies like Wuthering Heights or shows like Euphoria, which are much more appealing to the girls out there. So on the whole, I would say I was happily surprised by the movie, and I would definitely recommend it to anybody who is interested in, hellish dystopian science fiction stories, or people are struggling to survive and that sort of thing. Or if you're just a Ridley Scott fan, and at this point I should admit my bias, because way back in the day when I first got out of college, I worked on Hannibal in the summer of 2000, actually spring of 2000 through the fall of 2000. It was a really cool kind of early work experience right after college, where I was the assistant to Branko Lustig, one of the producers on the film, and I was more his driver, but they called me an assistant because I wasn't in the transportation union or anything like that. But this T-shirt is actually the stunt department T-shirt, and on the back, I don't know if I'm flexible enough, and we have to just take my word for it. On the back, it just says, "Are you going to eat that?" which I thought was very clever. But and I apologize for telling this story for the 50th time on this channel, but when I was working on that movie, there was a scene in the movie where a bunch of cop cars and unmarked vehicles are driving across a bridge, and they were one driver short for the shot. And it was like 3 a.m, and I just happened to be standing there. And suddenly, before I even knew what was happening, they were putting an FBI jacket on me and an FBI baseball cap on me. And I was getting behind the wheel of this Grand Marquis and following these cars. And they said, "Look, your car's not as fast as the other cars, but when we say go, just gun it." I was like, all right, I'm 24 years old working on a Ridley Scott movie, and I'm being asked to drive a car across a bridge in the middle of the night. Life is pretty good at this moment. I'm not entirely sure that was legal or safe or anything like that, but I got to do it, and the shot's in the movie, so after the shot was over, I bought one of the stunt department T-shirts, and it's just a really fun movie experience all around. And I loved getting an opportunity to see Ridley in action, and the way he would, on the way to work, he'd be drawing all of his Ridley grams, and like he wouldn't do storyboards, but he'd do these loose sketches, and he'd arrive on the set, hand it over to his first AD, and then he'd go off and smoke a cigar and drink espresso and that sort of thing. And his AD would start setting up his shots for the day, and it was just fascinating watching him work. And a quarter century later, people still seem to enjoy the movie. But a couple years ago, I did a giant video ranking the entire filmography of Ridley Scott, because I mistakenly thought at the time perhaps his career was finally drawing to a close. But I think since I did that video, I think he's released 3 movies. I think he released Napoleon, Gladiator 2, and now The Dog Star. So I'm not going to do any more filmography videos about Ridley Scott until he moves on to filmmaker heaven. But I think his parents lived to like their late 90s, so I think Ridley will be with us for a little while longer. But the big question is, how much longer does he want to keep doing this shit? I mean, I think part of it is that these movies are keeping him alive. But I just saw in the news today that he wants to do a sequel to Alien Covenant. And I was like, all right, well, whatever you do, if you do a sequel to Alien Covenant, it's got to be better than fucking Alien Earth, that Noah Hawley show, which I fucking despise. It had one really good episode, but the rest was just dreadful. So if Ridley wants to come back to the Alien franchise, more power to him at this point. He's earned the privilege to do whatever the hell he wants, and at 88 years old, if he can still find financing and movie stars and a great cast and crew with which to make his movies, he's got my full blessing to do whatever the hell he wants to do with the rest of his life. But before I wrap this video up, I do want to go into a few spoilers, because I can't make my final points about the structure of the film in the third act without going into spoiler train. So this is my spoiler warning, 3, 2, 1. If you're still with me, you don't mind having the ending of the movie spoiled, but this movie's got a very loose structure. But the first third is all about the day-to-day Jacob Elordi, like, flying to small communities and bringing them supplies and helping out and just being a good guy all around. But like, hoping and dreaming that he might find a community, like there might be more people out there. The middle of the movie is when he goes off on his own, falls in love with the character played by Margaret Qually. And Josh Brolin, they kept cutting back to Josh Brolin. It's like, all right, well, they wouldn't keep cutting back to Josh Brolin, who Jacob Elordi's been living with, unless that story is going to continue in some way. And sure enough, he eventually gets invaded by this, horde of fucking rampaging lunatics straight out of Mad Max. They're not like, wearing the assless chaps and driving vehicles covered in spikes like something out of The Road Warrior, but they're pretty crazy, pretty dangerous, and Josh Brolin just gets to go buck wild, going to war with all of them. I was like, all right, I think that storyline's finally going to draw to a close, and now we can focus on Jacob Elordi. But the third act of this movie, basically the home where Guy Pearce and Margaret Qualley live gets invaded, so they have to take off very abruptly. And so they land in this community. It's basically just an airport, but it's a community that's like something out of Fallout. Like if a lot of this movie is inspired by Mad Max or things like that, the third act is definitely inspired by people who have either played Fallout 3. Actually, the book came out in 2012, so you probably would have played Fallout 1, 2, and 3, but I can't remember when Fallout 4 came out, but maybe Fallout New Vegas. It is weird and deranged, and it felt like a really cool community that you would only find after like wandering hours out in the middle of nowhere, and suddenly you find this just deranged community where psychopaths are completely, totally in charge. And these psychos are led by Allison Janney, who's a terrific actress, and they just let her go to the dark side. It's a really cool scene but it comes so late in the movie, and it's so bizarre, and it's so different from everything else that came before. It kind of blindsides you and comes out of nowhere. And I feel like they should have tried to tease it or tee it up a little bit earlier, just so it felt like part of the rest of the movie, because it just seems to come out of nowhere. And it was, I mean, I was just, my jaw was dropping to the floor during this scene where just these complete and total lunatics start to act in increasingly disturbing ways. And luckily, it all ends happily as our heroes shoot their way out of there. But I think it'll make or break with the viewing experience for a lot of people. Where some people say that was by far the coolest part of the movie. More of that, please. And other people say, like, what the fuck was that all about? And then, like, you know, they were unable to get back into the movie once that whole series of scenes draws to a close. But the movie does end in very happy fashion. At the very end of the movie, I was not expecting to feel chills at all, but basically there's a community of Mennonites where all of our heroes gather with them and decide to live with them and help them out however they can. But they're playing this kind of old-timey, like, you know, like country music or bluegrass or whatever. And Josh Brolin, who's just been, you know, Mr. Total Hostility, he's a total misanthrope. He's been hating people the entire movie. But he sees a guitar lying there, and he picks up a guitar and wanders over and joins the band and starts playing along. And once again, just, nothing but goose flesh up and down my arms. So it's a very satisfying ending. So, yeah, I enjoyed the movie. It's not on the level of Gladiator. It's not on the level of Black Rain. It's not on the level of Legend. R.I.P. Tim Curry. I found out earlier today he died, but he absolutely made that movie.
You're nothing but an animal.
We are all animals, my lady. Most are too afraid to see it.
It's definitely not on the level of The Duelists or Alien or Blade Runner. But as far as 21st century Ridley Scott goes, I'd say it's on the level of something like The Last Duel, like not a perfect Ridley Scott movie, but worth seeing. So every once in a while, Ridley will have a movie that's pretty cool. Or he'll have a movie like The Martian, which is a big, giant, crazy runaway success. We're like, whoa. Where did that come from? So Ridley, as long as he continues to make movies, I will continue to show up and I'll support him in all of his endeavors. But if I were to recommend his movies, definitely check out the early days of Ridley, as well as the early days of his brother, Tony Scott. We lost Tony Scott way too early, but Tony Scott gave us some great movies like True Romance and Crimson Tide. And between those two brothers, they've given us a lot of great movies to enjoy over the last 50 years. So I'm team Ridley and Tony Scott and Scott Free and all that good stuff. I think they're we've been blessed to live in a time when they've been cranking out all these great movies. But with that, I think I'm going to wrap up this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If so, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting that notification bell, becoming a member, yada, yada, yada. Hope everybody has a great weekend, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.